All right, guys, today we are looking, and we're going to be looking at fundamentals for a while, but we're looking at the elements of shape and form. And they really go together because ultimately shapes make up forms, but there are some distinct differences from them. So let's talk about that. Let's break down looking at some of the definitions first, and then we'll go back and forth between the PowerPoint and the examples and kind of look at the different components of each. So of course the first that we're going to look at are shapes and the kind of the definition and their importance and the different types. So what is a shape? Well, a shape is a two-dimensional area. Okay, and in its most basic sense, it's defined by width and height. And the boundaries of that shape, we'll say, are often done, we'll say boundaries defined by lines, contrast, or color. So the most common way, so if you think, right, if you have a square, this is two-dimensional, right? Because there's no dimension to it. It's on paper. Anything that's like on paper is going to be two-dimensional. We'll see with forms, if you have a cube, if I'm drawing it on paper, it's still technically two-dimensional, but it's drawn in a way that appears three-dimensional. And then you're going to have other forms that are actually have physical shape to them, right? So the square, two-dimensional, and it's defined by its width and its height. Let's make that a little bit longer there. So it actually looks like height. Okay, so that's that part. And then the lines that are making up the square. So that's the main, kind of basic definition of a shape. If you didn't do lines, if you, let's say you colored it with a color crayon or marker or whatever around, and then you define the boundaries of a square so that everything around the square, so essentially like this, right? So if I kept shading in stuff here and coloring everything but the square, then it's not so much lines as the color that you now have there. Good enough, right? That's where you'd have color and contrast actually come in to define the boundaries of it. It doesn't change, right? It looks like, we all know, we learned our shapes in elementary school. You know what a shape is. It's just how it's being portrayed, right? And then ultimately it can be used specifically to define space. So shapes can be used to define space. If you think about why shapes are important, is ultimately lines are the most fundamental element of art, but shapes are the ones we see most clearly. And that's really true. Like we observe things in shapes before we observe it in lines. And that is just because everything kind of makes up this, in our brain, a connection between objects, what those shapes are, which is why I had you do that worksheet that's kind of looking at that one picture and how many shapes. And then the reality is that most of you probably didn't find all of the shapes because there are a lot. So let's look at types of shapes. So the first is geometric. Right, and geometric is like with a regular line, it falls under that same aspect because it's composed of regular lines and curves. It can have curves like the circle and stuff like that. These tend to be connected to mathematical structure. Okay, you tend, and they're most often used in math as well. What are the basic, right? What are the main shapes of geometric? You have square, circle, triangle, etc. Those are the main three building ones. But of course, you have rectangle. You could have hexagon, octagon, so on. But the building blocks of geometric shapes are those. And these are done by essentially they're created by plotting a series of points and connecting those points with lines. Right, they're going to be like the regular lines. If you're looking at the comparison with lines, it's regular lines. Then we have organic. Right, well here when we'll put, so a lot of times too, you'll see geometric shapes are done with a use of a tool, because if you're trying to get it as exact as possible, it's helpful to have a ruler or other measuring device, and that's also where you get the mathematical component to it. So organic shapes, right? These are made up of unpredictable, irregular lines. And the organic, just like irregular lines, tend to be connected to nature, where we could put here, right? This tends to be the human-made, nature with the structure of organic, the natural world tends to get connected with that. So a shape like organic shape, say examples, right? You could have that like what would look like a paint splatter, for example, or a puddle, anything that and you also animals, trees, fruit, anything that you could think of with that is going to be organic. I was trying to think of a good example for one that would work, or even a mountain range, right? It's not geometric. Kids will often make mountain range geometric, but that they're not in that sense. So that's not with full shape. I'd have to color in. Let's do one other one. Let's see, or even right, if you have a leaf, and what we were drawing yesterday with the apple. Okay, those are organic lines, because it's not they're not using regular lines in the same way, and it's not always predictable, and they can be crazy, they can be seemingly more ordered, but that's organic. It's the same. So think about it as organic is connected to your regular lines, and geometric is connected to regular lines. So you get the same sense of meaning behind it too, which is that if we add over here, right, that this is going to create a sense of order and planning. It's also, again, why it's also connected to man-made, whereas organic shapes are going to seem more chaotic. We'll do not chaos, chaotic, random, unique, right? Along with, of course, nature. So those should be easy to remember, because if you know irregular and regular lines, you just have to translate that to a shape. So it's not just a line, it's points with the either regular or irregular lines connecting them to make that. And this applies for organic too, right? Where we talked about you're plotting a series of points and connecting them with lines. In geometric, you're connecting them with regular lines. In organic, you're connecting them with irregular lines. And then you have implied shape. And this too should now sound familiar, because it's the same as implied lines, right? The shape is implied, but not used, not created with actual lines. So in that you can have, you know, like a circle that does any of the connect the dots, right? Connect the dots. If you ever done the activity of connect the dots, that's implied shapes. You can, and the implied shapes, just like implied lines, can be very creative in what they do, right? These are simple examples here, so you don't spend your time watching me for 10 minutes try to do something more elaborate. But you get the idea of, right, that I'm making up, and this is what's interesting with implied lines, and I'll write this down in just a second, is that, implied shapes, right? See, I'm even mixing them up, is that implied shapes can be made up of other shapes. So if you look at this one, this is a triangle, an implied triangle, just to be clear, made up from other shapes. You could even have an implied triangle made up of smaller triangles. So the smaller triangles are not implied, right? Because those would be actual triangles, but then the larger triangle would be the implied shape. So it can get a little detailed depending on how you decided to, you know, if you're making a small triangle, is to make an implied large triangle. And then let's see, the last thing with that before we'll keep going with that. Contrast is important. It's not really a type though. What I do want to say with contrast is that, we'll put it as a type in the sense of how it can be utilized. So contrast is when an artist uses two clearly different styles of element or types of elements to essentially highlight one or both. And that is used to, so we'll look at, this is going to get connected to positive and negative shapes. So where we see this used most often is positive and negative shapes. But you can see I used it here in the implied triangle. The contrast of color, the contrast of shapes. This can be, so you, and this works for lines too, right? Irregular and regular lines. Same thing as when both, is that artists often use regular and irregular lines. you usually have both geometric and organic shapes used. And that's, you know, so it's actually, when you see art that is used that only uses one type, it often stands out because that's not kind of how our world is set up. So let's take a look at a couple things, and then we will go back to look at positive and negative shapes. And I have a really good transition example. So shapes and forms, right? This one is good because we're going to come to forms, right? Right now we're just looking at shapes. So you get the geometric shapes, you got the organic shapes, but these go into geometric forms, and organic shapes go into organic forms. And the difference, right? Man-made versus found in nature. Here is just the example, right? These are the basic building blocks, which would be forms if it was real blocks, but I'm using it metaphorically here, of art for shapes, right? Just like lines is that basic one, these are the top 3 shapes that then you're used to make up a lot of other things. Obviously, there are other geometric shapes. These are just the foundational ones. And then you have organic shapes. So like that, there you go, the leaf clover would be the clover. They have a leaf clover. So you get that a pear, nature, but also just random stuff as well. But if you look at it, nature, everything has a component of geometric and organic systems, just like with the lines. And although I think there's a difference, and if you look in nature with shapes, it tends to be made up of geometric and organic, whereas with lines are more often irregular. Okay, and then the next went back accidentally. So implied shape, here's a couple of, so I gave you that example too. Here's another one. This would be, there you go, connect the dots. It's the easiest way to think of it. If you're like, give an example of an implied shape, you can do something super creative. And it works with words too. So just like the implied lines works with words, where we saw with the religious text, you can do that with implied shape as well. Anything you can possibly think of to imply that shape, and that can be using the contrast there of where you don't actually draw the shape. So it kind of looks like I'm drawing a triangle because I'm making the outline for it, but I didn't technically use actual lines to draw this triangle, just like I showed you with this square. And so what you get is you get this shape, but it definitely is an implied shape because what's being colored in, and you could make it even more or less obvious by how much you did or didn't do in the outside, that where we can see that. Now the next one is a really good example. So do you see the implied shape? This is also moves us into, this is positive, this is implied shape. It is also a positive and negative shape. Okay, so I picked this one because it was a perfect transition to show. So where's the implied shape? Right, and there, and going this way too, and all throughout. It's positive and negative. We're going to look at that because of these. Usually positive and negative shapes are black and white, but it can be done in color too. But then you have this contrast between a darker color and a lighter color or shade. And so in this one, within the positive and negative shape, you get also an implied shape. All right, there's a lot with positive and negative, so let's look at that. I'm going to write just a few things about that, and then we're going to look at several of the examples. Positive and negative shape is, I think, one of my favorites, just because of how creative you can be with it. There's so much. So positive and negative, right, these are opposites. That's the idea behind that. and they need each other to contrast and comparison. So black and white, right, is the most obvious because it has the one of the biggest contrast. If you just had something that was all black, that's problematic. You're not going to see anything. It needs the white to complement the black, and then by doing so, has it stand out. Essentially, without positive and negative, then there wouldn't be anything existing. Now, colors you can do, it's more subtle, whereas like I said, black and white is super obvious, and you most of the time if you Google search positive and negative shapes, most of those things are going to show up in black and white, but you can do it with colors. But then this is where when we learn about color theory is important, because you do want to use the right colors to establish a positive and negative color. And in visual form, like I said, mostly black and white. It also, most of the time, uses negative space to create images or illusions. And this is what's fun about it. So let's take a, well, let me do the one last thing with positive and negative, which is called figure ground reversal. And this is, like I said, often done only with positive and negative shapes as well. This is where a figure changes in an image. And you have, it's not just the figure, but the negative shape changes to positive. So you have the image change from one thing to another, and the negative and positive shapes change as well. Okay, so let's look at those. This is, I like this one just because it broke it down so it made it clear, right? The negative shape is the white. The positive shape, or color, sorry, here, is black. And so you tend to have the darker, right, is going to be the positive, and then what's left. Now, this isn't always the case, because what can happen is, essentially, it's, you have the dominant shape. So here's red, right? And then this looks like what's left, the negative, is what was left or was not finished or not filled in, right? So you have the positive and the negative. So again, it doesn't have to be black and white, but you have essentially a bolder color or shade, and then a lighter one. So that it kind of reminds me of this idea of the void, right? The negative aspect tends to be the void, and the positive is the what you actually like drew, right? So that the, here, we'll put it here. This is the actual drawing, and the negative is the void. So if you see a black and white photo, it's easy to go, okay, black is probably positive, white is the negative. If it's color, then you've got to look more carefully at what is the actual drawing, what is the void, right? Because then the void is going to be the negative, and the actual drawing is going to be the positive. So let's look at a couple examples. And again, positive and negative shapes are perfect for illusions. Here's an example. So and it depends on what is, here is the positive, here is the positive. It's the same picture, but they reversed what was positive and what was negative. So when this, which looks like a vase, right, or a candle holder, either or vase or candle holder, when the vase or candle holder is positive, right, then you see that first most of the time. Unless you've seen these before, then sometimes your brain can play tricks on you. And then you see faces in the negative. if you go over to another one, then you have the vase, right? But you see the faces first and the vase second. Vase first, faces second. It can also play on what you see in that process. But so this is a good example of how they use it for illusion, and that, right, there's nothing that says, right, you can have the same picture and you can play around with what's positive or what's negative to draw out what we're visually seeing first. This is by Noma Barr, called, it's titled Gun Crime. This one's in your book. This one is great for also showing that oftentimes positive and negative shapes and art in general have hidden, not fully hidden, but disguised pictures or images, right? So you have the shape of the gun here, and then this is the positive, and then in the negative space you have a person who looks like they've been, killed by the gun, or killed and implied that it's by the gun, and then a little bit of red for the blood. So there's their mouth, their eyes, their nose, and at the same time, right, it's just the trigger as well. So there's so much fun things that you can do. I think we're going to do an extra credit on this because it's really fun to play around with how to use positive and negative art to not only create illusions, but these kind of, right, if we get rid of my writing for just a second, that at first glance you might not have noticed this image. You noticed the gun and it blew it up. It did have a definitive edge because it kind of looks like it just continues. I promise this does look more like, if you look in your book, you see the whole defined space of the gun. It clearly looks like a gun from the start. This just kind of bled into the edges of the PowerPoint, so it looks less like it. But a lot of people don't actually recognize the face right off the bat. And if they had removed the red, probably even less people would have noticed it right off the bat. So you have to take a second and actually look into this and pay attention to it, because artists can play around with it, and you create a different meaning of, it's not just an artwork of a gun. They're actually protesting gun violence, and you do see that. Let me go back for just a second. That in positive and negative art and shapes, that you see it's used in advertising and commentary, which could be political or social, a lot. So you see this type of art tends to kind of have a genre of what people are using it for, because it can be so clever, right? All right, let's look at the next one here. This is for a zoo, right? And so I guess graphics for different companies tend to use positive and negative art as well. So you have the elephant, but then and here's one with color, right? I liked this one because you could see the color, and then you have the negative, and then in it you have an animal here and an animal there. And so you have this kind of clever, use of the negative space and the negative shapes to have additional animals. So the elephant's the big picture and what you see first, because you see positive shapes first. But then you have those other components in it as well. This is the figure ground reversal. Okay? And this one, again, the cleverness of how to use it. You have, when you start, it's a bird, and it's in positive. So bird and positive. And then as it goes down, which is why it's called ground reversal, because it's going to the ground, right? The slowly begins to change, and it's very subtle, where all of a sudden what was the bird becomes the background, and instead you have a shift to a fish that starts out negative, and by the end moves to positive. And what's clever, right? It doesn't have to be fully that you still have the black background, but you have the it's not solid white, right? In that, so you can play around too with how much positive and negative or color you use. It doesn't have to. It's most commonly seen with solid coloring, but that's not required. But so that's the transition of the figure of the bird on top, and then slowly transitioning. And if you it's harder to see here, but once you know that it transforms to a fish, you can actually see the outline of a fish. But then what goes away is that the bird goes away, where all you see is the outline of the bird, which is even harder to see than the outline of the fish, because it's the black is in the background with the negative shape standing out, whereas here you have, and they've also done a reversal, that's also something to pay attention to, of the color on top. So here, you know, it's the positive color that we would most associate as just the background with the negative, but up top here, it's the negative with the bird being the positive. So everything reversed, which is why it's called reversal. And so it's something to pay attention to, right? They didn't just reverse one thing. You have multiple things, and you can, if I get all of my marks up away for just a second, what you can see, right, is that it's kind of a halfway point where it reverses everything that it's doing, right? This is first, and then you have a complete reversal on the bottom half. I think that's the last one, yep, for shapes. Okay, so now we're going to move into forms and look at what forms are. Forms are, right, if a two-dimensional object is a shape, then forms are three-dimensional objects. And those are called forms. Now, there's going to be forms that are actual three-dimensional. Let's put that here as right, so that you can have actual three-dimensional art, or you can have essentially what is an impression or illusion of three-dimensional. Because anything, again, that's on paper that doesn't have actual form is going to, even if it looks three-dimensional, it's not. It's just drawn or painted to appear that way. So you have several main elements that are key to forms. All right. The first is you're going to have the, again, shapes make up forms, or part of forms. So you have length and width, which are important, but you also have now height, or you have width and height, and now you have length, sorry. And then you have depth, you have volume, mass, and texture. These ones are connected to the actual physical three-dimensional. And those are ones that we're going to look at in the next lecture. All right, so you could have, if it's an impression or illusion or representation of a three-dimensional object, you end up having the height, width, length, and depth. But if it's an actual, let's say, sculpture, a sculpture would be three-dimensional. Then it's going to have actual volume, actual mass, actual texture. Okay, you can have implied volume, mass, and texture in a drawing, but then there's the actual. So we're dealing again with the exact same thing of actual and implied. Forms occupy three-dimensional space. and exist in a real and solid way. Again, when not represented in as, you know, when they're not actually two-dimensional. I'm going to show you examples, which I'm drawing on here. Those are technically two-dimensional to appear three-dimensional, but then we're going to actually look at actual three-dimensional forms. One of the key aspects of forms that makes it so different is that forms are tactile. And what does that mean? It means that we can feel them, so we can touch them. You can't always if they're in a museum, but you know, if it was free to do, or if you were creating it, right? It's something you can physically touch. It has texture because of that, because they're actual objects that exist in real space. And this very much is important to the message of the artwork, right? You want, if you are looking at a form, if you're looking at a sculpture, you very much want to pay attention to the texture of that sculpture. You also very much want to pay attention to scale, because most of the time the artists have chosen their texture, their medium, whether it's marble, fur, metal, whatever, very carefully, and it's used to make a point. Also, they have chosen how big or small they want it to be, because, so this is, you know, how big or small. And that the reason that this is important, so we'll say why important, because because forms are three-dimensional, because forms, and they exist in actual space, in real space, right, and have that physical component. What happens is that the scale, which is the size, right, changes the meaning of the art. All right, and the viewer's perception of it. For example, and we're going to look at scale as an element, we're going to look at it as a fundamental a little bit later in more detail. If you had a sculpture of a person that was small, and then you had another sculpture of a person that was large, right? The head looks small there for that. How you perceive each of these sculptures is going to be very different. And you could even get into the minuscule. There are artists that like carve the tips of pencils, right? And they have to use a magnifying glass to do it. How you perceive each one is, even if these were the same sculptures, how you perceive each of these and the meaning is going to change based on that size. And the artists aren't usually doing this just randomly. They're picking the scale on purpose with intent, because it is meant to give you a sense of awe as you look up at this massive sculpture, or maybe make you feel big as you peer down and look at this tiny, you know, sculpture. Maybe they use scale in comparison to the surroundings around them to give a sense of not only importance, right? Because we tend to see big things as important and smaller things as not, but also its place within things in the world. And then you have volume. And volume, right? Then we mentioned with it, the volume is the amount of actual space a form occupies. Come on. And then mass, it basically describes the concept that volume is solid and occupies space. Nope, go away. There you go. Okay, so the amount of actual space is the volume. So the volume, you do this in like math when you're doing geometry, right? Here's a beaker filled up with water to calculate the volume. That's the full thing. The mass is also, the way to think of it is volume is space. Mass tends to be the weight, which can be actual or perceived. Okay, so that plays a role too. And again, we're going to look at volume and mass in way more detail later, but not in this lecture, because they're fundamentals in their own right. But the art and forms that's one of the benefits, right? You can draw something, but it doesn't necessarily always portray a mass in that same sense. But if you, here's a good example in movies, when they have like a boulder or a rock, is created, right? That an artist made that as a prop, and they made it to appear to look like an actual rock. And so in our heads, we have then translated based on that look of how much mass it has. But if it's made out of foam, it's actually lighter. So the actual mass is less than the perceived mass. Or it could be the exact mass that material makes, in terms of it looks like metal, or it looks like a rock, and it is a rock, and it has the mass that size of a rock would have. But artists will play around with that sometimes, so that they'll make it look like there's a large perceived mass, but in actuality it isn't. Or in other times, making something look like it's light, but it actually has a large mass to it. And then the last one that I mentioned with the tactile is texture. And again, why we're only doing the basic kind of definition, not even a full definition here, is because we're going to talk about these more later. But you need to kind of know these in terms of, in the next lecture, we're going to look at some of these. And you need to know these now, though, when we talk about form, because they play a role in it, right? So texture is the surface of the form. And it can be anything. So you can have, it could be cool, hot, it can be rough, soft, etc., right? And the key with texture, right, is that it's tactile, and it can be experienced through touch and directly. Now, again, you can't always touch things if they're in a museum and they don't want you to touch it. And if you can't actually touch it, it's the imagined feel of the texture that still plays a role in our perception of that art. So the actual will play a role, but even the imagination of it, just by looking at it and knowing what that texture is, plays a role in how you kind of experience that component of it. The next thing, let's see, where were we on that? I think we're still on H, so we're on I here. You have geometric forms, which, just like with shapes, right, that they're based on regular geometric shapes, but three-dimensional. And expressed in terms of mathematics. It's the same, right? We don't need to go too much into that. Again, you don't usually have, you have individual geometric forms. You don't usually have a whole artwork made up of geometric forms. But the main ones for these are going to be a cube. Well, here we'll put types. Ooh, my thing's getting delayed here. Come on, there we go, types. So you can have a cube, a pyramid, a sphere, you know, a cone. Those are kind of the main, oh, and cylinder. These are the main geometric forms. So let's look at some examples. And this is a good one to show again how the shape makes up the form. Okay, so if you start with a square, right, and we have a vague example of a square. Here, I won't put the, let's put, whoop. Everything is going to something else today. Then a cube, right, is made up of squares. Right, so you have the square is a series, a cube is a series of squares. Then you have the triangle. And from there, and these are easy to try. You could try along, right? Of, you know, trying to see if you're wanting to, you know, look a little more clearly on how how shapes are used to make forms, right? Try playing around with these, right? So you have the pyramid, what you wouldn't see in the background here. So the dotted line just implies what we can't see because it's blocking our view. You have the circle, which makes up the sphere. And now, how do you represent a sphere? You can do it by showcasing kind of this idea of roundedness. You could also start using some shading to represent with, and we're going to look at this, it's called chiaroscuro. As far as light, it doesn't work as well with a digital with the type of drawing tool I'm using. We'll just stick with the other, but or with shading and light. There we go. I need more refined tips to be able to actually shade it in. Okay, and then if you have a circle, come back. Circle here is looking pretty sad. All right, I might have to pause it here if it's going to keep freezing up on me and not letting me write. Every time I erase it, then it takes a second to go back. Let's try it. Come on. All right, there. Okay, so a circle plus a triangle. Right? Then what do you get? You get the cone. So you have the circle, right? So there you have the cone. And we can go with the last one. We look at the cylinder. You have a circle plus a rectangle. which that's kind of the derivative of the square, right? And so here you have the circle, and then you have the rectangle, and then the circle again. And then what we don't see is the rest of that circle. Okay, so right, that fundamental building blocks of the circle, triangle, and square are super important, because then you see how these basic shapes go in to make forms. And then think of it in looking, and these are all geometric, right? Forms. So if you have geometric shapes, it goes into geometric forms. But look at stuff in the world, your phone, the computer, the house, and how even organic stuff, where you have a mix of organic shape, which is the next one here. Put J, organic shape, or organic form, sorry. We just already did organic shape. But even in organic forms, like a tree, that if you're looking at the branch, while it might have their irregular lines, and it's made up and it has organic components and organic forms to it, it also has some geometric forms in it. So a branch, right, often has parts in some areas that are small cylinders. And even if, and then here's the difference too, is that this is one of the drawing tips for that, is if you have, and I showed you this with the tree example, that a lot of times one of the ways why kids draw, you know, basic trees like this, is because while trees don't look like this, right, if you like superimposed this over a tree that was around the same size, it has a general visual form of that type of form. So if you're trying to figure out with drawing, if you can break it down into its basic forms, specifically geometric forms, and then you move, you know, so you have this as the outline, and then from there you start adding in the organic component of a tree, and right, and then it's that the branches then are coming out and they're irregular, right, so that it's not that simple of a shape, but it's a starting point that you go with, and then you can add on to. It makes it actually easier to draw or paint the organic forms, because the reality is that it's sometimes harder when it's organic to connect, to say, okay, how can we make this look, you know, like it is, when it seems kind of random. And you might have like a branch that goes out there, but the idea is that what started out in a basic or geometric, just like with the forms here, you can have the shapes to form, you can have geometric to organic, in the sense that the foundation can be, oops, let's not cover up that, right, that you have the we'll do it over here. Organic forms, right, but that the foundation is in these shapes that you can translate into both organic shape or organic form. And so this is the same for shapes, right, as I have the organic, the geometric as the foundation, and then the organic as the, you know, the actual in terms of that. I don't know why that came up. But do you see, like, I mean, I made this smaller, but if I made the circle larger, you've got that foundational base, but what it turns out in the end is something different. And just like with organic shapes, organic forms are the things in the natural world. This doesn't change. It's just one is two-dimensional and one is three-dimensional. So you tend to see it in plants, forms, right? Animals, that change constantly, and so does their form. So you get a sense of, etc. in the natural world where their form, people would count to, changes right through time. So you get more of organic forms tend to represent change along with the natural world. And it can also be used specifically to, artists will often use what's called distorted form. So one of the ways that you can use organic is that you can distort organic and geometric shapes, but it works best in organic, which is why you tend to see it more in there, is that the artist intentionally distorts organic shape and form to highlight either a part of the object or idea. And we'll look, there's an example of that in a minute that we will look at. Okay, so let's stop right there. That's a perfect place to stop and look at. This is a geometric sculpture or form. It's a sculpture too. It's called In the Round. But here you see, right, everything is made up of the geometric forms. You've got the cube, you've got cylinders, and you've got various aspects of the cube. It's called cubics. Here you see sculpture, and this is called In the Round, and we're going to look at this more in just a minute, of where you have organic, because it's not, now again, you could argue that when you're looking at any sculpture, that there is a sense of organic foundation or geometric foundation. But it's not this. I think these are really good examples to contrast of what you see when you have geometric form, which then with these sculptures is In the Round, and organic form. Oops. I wanted to talk about In the Round too. So the last thing we're looking at is these sculptures and reliefs, which is going to play on what we were just talking about. So I got ahead of myself on there because I actually do want to expand on that. So we're going to go with 2 here with sculpture, which is a form, right? And then you have In the Round and relief. So we'll just go over those and then we'll look at the rest of them. So In the Round is it's a sculpture that can be, so it is a form. Okay, so that's important. Sculpture is a form. And In the Round sculpture is meant to be viewed from all sides. It, just like anything else, right, of what we looked at, they're often freestanding works that occupy space in the same way as other real life objects. Now, the size and scale can be different than the real life objects, but often then the other ones, they're meant to be that exact same thing. When it's in the round, it is super important as the viewer to look at all angles. When you have an artist who is making a sculpture, they know that people are going to be looking at it from more than one angle. And we're going to look at some clever examples of why, if you only looked at it from one angle, you actually are missing out, because it's a 360-degree thing that every aspect of it is important, right? When you're drawing, it's just the front. I can't see any of the other stuff. There's no depth in this. And even in the cube, right, you're still not seeing that. But if it's an actual form, such as a sculpture, right, these different faces you can see, and that there might be differences to that, that plays a role in that. So usually you also feel compelled to look further, so that it in the round tends to create an experience, and your view of the art changes as you continue to look at each side. So in this way, there is a sense of interaction. Not as much if we're looking at it on a screen, but if you're walking around, right, the idea of sculpture is the act of walking around to observe it, to view all sides. Okay, and so that, you know, you get this is definitely an attribute of good three-dimensional design. You can have sculptures and forms that you don't have, the back is plain and doesn't look done. That could be on purpose. It also just because that they focus on one side. Really good three-dimensional design is a 360 degree of everything matters. Okay, so, and we're going to look at that. Keep that in mind. Then you have relief is the other type of sculpture. And a relief is essentially, it's three-dimensional, but projects from a flat base. So here you do not have, it's meant to only be viewed from one side. You don't have that purpose of 360 degrees. It's done intentionally. You usually see these are most often on buildings as a facade. So it will be like on the, where you'll look at it, you see, like, especially like Greek and Roman architecture, they have lots and lots of reliefs around the temples and other things like that. And it can combine two and three-dimensional aspects, especially depending on whether you have high relief or bas relief. High relief is more closely, they will say this is most like a sculpture in the round. So it's going to be more pronounced from the flat surface. And it's usually, it's meant to have the forms and figures stand out. You can also play with high relief, where you have a mix of high relief and what's called bas relief, which is the low relief, to give a sense of depth. And we'll look at that in just a second. Just figure I might as well finish this so we can just talk about both of them. And then bas relief is low relief. Bas means low. So this can often appear almost two-dimensional. And it is a sculpture technique where the main emphasis tends to be on the design elements, and the lines and the shapes over form. It still has some form, but because what it is overall close to a flat surface. Again, close to that two-dimensional component. Okay, so now let's look. Sorry, I got ahead there on that. So this is in the round, right? Sculpture in the round. This is Naked Aphrodite. This one is in your book. This is a good one. I liked having the two pictures because it shows, since we can't walk around these ourselves, it shows us what's important about, if you ever are going and viewing sculptures in the round, you need to walk around it. So you have one perspective and two perspective here, right? And there would be more, if they had taken more shots, we could have gotten more. But what you see is different. So in this one, we see her face. The way her pose looks different. Right, and with her face, then we get an expression which is going to change how we view this. Her hairstyle, right? This one, she is looking, it almost looks like she's looking at us, like we caught her. Right here, and on the number 1, you see the vase that she's sitting on. You don't see her face. And like I said, you have a jewelry that you see. And you see the arm position that you don't see on the other side. So what does this show us? What does this give us in perspective of that you, at least from just these two viewpoints, we get a different sense of one where she's looking, this one she appears more bold, right? She's looking directly at you. And you know, it doesn't look timid, doesn't look concerned, you know, maybe a little surprised at why are you looking at me, and you know, other than crouching, you don't see much of what's going on here. This one, she looks more timid or shy because it looks like her head is turned away from us. I mean, it is turned away from us, but the idea that it, you know, that she quickly turned her head because we, you know, caught her naked, I suppose. The arm also looks like a protective aspect. So do you see the difference in just from different views, how your perception and meaning of the sculpture can change? Now we have a couple extra ones. This is a good one. We're going to see 2 little short videos. Here is the sculpture. And this is hard to see because we don't have it from a perspective, but if you look at it from this perspective, or from this perspective, you're just going to see what looks like a bunch of copper. But then if you look at it from this angle here, you see that in the reflection, it makes a hand. So if someone only viewed it from the sculpture in the round from one way, from this particular one, you would miss the hand that's meant to reflect that. So I want to show two clips that show this changing perspective, right? Here's the first one. And, you know, just as a reminder, right, we talked about volume and mass, we're going to talk about it more. Sculptures, they don't have to be solid masses, and you have wire here, right? That it's not like the marble statues, right? Those give off the air of solid and sturdy, but that's not necessary, right? But you do want to examine how much volume, how much mass does it have? Does that play a role? Does it make it look more light and airy versus sturdy and strong? Okay, so here's this one. So you get the giraffes from one perspective, and then as you turn around and slowly look at it from a different angle, you get an elephant. Right, this one is meant to be looked at from two perspectives. They're gonna, oops, I'll finish playing. They're gonna go back. Right, so the artist, and then if you step back, right, here you go. The artist positioned it in a way so with the white background, so that you aren't, so that you aren't going from the other side, right? So that one had a limited number of viewpoints. It's in the round, but not completely in the round. But that you get giraffes in one and elephant in the other. This one is a 3-in-1 essentially. You can get it, there you go. So, and this is just a digital recreation. This is an actual sculpture. So while this is just a digital model of how you see it, I put up a picture, we'll look at it. It's an actual sculpture. So depending on the angle that you look, you get a different number. So here we start, from that angle you see 1, and then as you rotate around you see the number 2, and then as you rotate it around again, you see the number 3, right? So that if you always approach sculptures in the round with the idea of trying to examine it from multiple angles, because there are lots of sculptures that the artists are very much, here it is, right? 1, 2, 3. And then here is organic form in the round versus this one was out of place. I know I was missing one when I showed you the geometric. I was like, wait, the Aphrodite one's not correct. That makes sense now. So I meant to compare and contrast, right? The geometric sculpture with an example of organic, and just how the difference in how it comes off. Of course, texture and volume and mass and all those other things play a role, scale as well. And then this was distorted organic form. Remember I talked about it? And this one's in your book, and they talk about it too. You have Jesus, who is, and it's definitely organic form. The human body is organic form. But his head to his body size is intentionally distorted. I know some people look at this and be like, oh, that's just bad art. they obviously aren't very good sculptors. And sometimes distorted stuff could come up because someone isn't good at what their intent. It's always about what's the intent, right? And here, the distorted part is meant to create this idea of Jesus suffering, right? The fact that it looks wrong. His body does not look right. It's meant to show an emaciated person who has been tortured and killed. It's meant to show that suffering, right? And so that the body and to the head and even the position of the neck is intentionally distorted, because what distortion does is it draws our attention. Okay? So keep that in mind. It could be what you then determine as bad art, or an artist who's still learning, or it could be intentional distorted and with organic form. Distorted is more often used with organic form than geometric. Why? Because it's able to express a whole lot more emotions and feelings and thoughts than just having an awkward, well, really, if you distort a geometric form too much, it no longer is that. It's no longer a cube. It's no longer a cone. And so that becomes problematic as well. So distorted forms are distorted forms are organic. You can have, again, a mix of both, where there is geometric stuff, and most of the time you have geometric and organic forms together, but the distorted part tends to be more highly focused on the organic. And then we have relief. This is high relief, and I love relief. I think it's really cool. So here's the flat background, and then you have, see how they almost look like in the round, right? That's part of that, is that it's close to in the round. And then you have these people in the background that are lower relief. So they look like they're in the background. They're actually not. I mean, they are a little bit based on the height and stuff. But by intentionally making them blend more into the background, so that they're very, like the head has a little more 3-dimension than the body, it creates this sense of not only a crowded group of people, but that it's layers of people. So that's done intentionally. So high relief is relief because you always just look, does it have a, is it the base of this form on a flat back? So you can't go see the other side. There is no other side. It's up against a flat slab, often again on buildings. So if it doesn't have a back side at all that you can see, or it's entirely flat on the back, there's nothing there, there's no carving, because you could have a in the round where someone just didn't think about the back side of the in the round, and so they only carved a little bit, but you don't have the detail or a different perspective. But in relief, it's intentional. There is no background. It's just a flat slab. That's the base. You can clearly see, and then these are built upon the base of it. But again, high relief can almost look like in the round, whereas real bas relief almost looks 2-dimensional. And so here we see, this is from the Aztecs, that you have, or the Mayan art. This is from the Mayans, I believe. The Aztecs or Mayans. What you have here is, it's hard to see. I mean, one, it's the flat background, but this part here is barely raised, right? It's not much higher than the flat base. So the point is that the focus becomes on the design and shapes over the form. It still has form though. That's what's interesting with this, right? It still is 3-dimensional, and it still has that 3-dimensional form to it, but your emphasis is way more on the intricate design and shapes than in the round and every aspect about it. And again, a lot of times reliefs will play with high and low relief, but this gives you an example of one that just is bas relief versus one that's mixed. That's it. Okay, so that is shape and form. Next week we are moving on to looking at, I believe, volume and mass, which is part of the, we'll finish up chapter 1.2 in the first lectures next week.